Welcome back again, everyone. This is part 3 of our Chapter 20 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty, by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Birth of Civil Liberties. The focus question for this section is, why did the protection of civil liberties gain importance in the 1920s? Before we can understand when there was a surge in support for the concepts of civil liberties in this period, we must first understand what we mean when we use the term civil liberties. Essentially, civil liberties are rights an individual may assert even against democratic majorities. And this is very much closely associated with the concept of negative liberties that we have discussed previously in this course, and particularly in American History 1 if you took that course with me. And negative liberties, again, are the rights the government cannot by law infringe upon. And this is best exemplified in the American Bill of Rights, with its protections of things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, things of that nature. This is also associated with the concept of the tyranny of the majority. Within any democratic Republican society, if left unchecked, majority groups, whether that be political majorities or social majorities or what have you, can easily discriminate against minority groups, be that based on political opinion or social status or what have you. And the idea of civil liberties is meant to insulate minority groups from such discrimination. As we discussed earlier in this lecture, the wartime repression that Americans faced during World War I continued into the 1920s. And while many Americans accepted, at least to a considerable degree, that repression during the war in the interest of national security, once the war was over, that interest was gone. And as we stated in the previous slide, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and this conservative repression faced new liberal pushback with new emphasis on protecting the rights of minority groups, both political and social, but with a very strong emphasis on political minority groups at this time, particularly those that supported socialism, communism, things of that nature. And there was a new and vigorous defense of free speech mounted in the 1920s. Some people came to view the United States as a repressive cultural wasteland, and there was growing disillusionment in this period with American conservatism and materialism and the corrupting forces that many people saw as inherent within both those paradigms. And this was best manifested in the arts, particularly literature, as American writers like Ernest Hemingway and Henry Miller channeled this disillusionment into their art and created some of the finest examples of American literature in the 20th century. In 1919, just at the conclusion of the war, American courts initially supported restrictions on speech, and the best example of this is the case of Schenck versus the United States. A gentleman named Charles Schenck was charged under the Espionage Act with distributing anti-draft materials through the mail. The court held that the First Amendment did not prevent Congress from prohibiting speech that presented a clear and present danger. And the example that was used in the majority of opinion was that of yelling fire in a crowded theater, which most people still cite as an example of justifiable restrictions on free speech. But exactly what constituted a clear and present danger was very much open to interpretation by future court decisions. This period also saw the establishment of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which was founded in response to the issues raised by the Red Scare and such decisions as Schenck versus the United States, and the continued government repression of labor groups, anarchists, socialists, and communists. However, despite such decisions as Schenck versus the United States, a minority on the Supreme Court committed to a broader defense of free speech. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, this man you see right here, stated that all belief systems should be allowed equal hearing in what he termed the great marketplace of ideas. And by the end of the 1920s, the tide began to turn toward broader protections for civil liberties. Justice Louis Brandeis, this gentleman you see here, claimed that free speech was essential to an active citizenship in a democracy. Slowly but surely, over the course of the next few decades, courts began to establish a judicial foundation for the protections of civil liberties. That concludes part 3 of our Chapter 20 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.